So I want to start with talking about the fact that not so much recently, but there definitely has been a lot of talk in the past years in the psychological self-help world about the importance of boundaries in a relationship. And as well as, which ties into this fact of boundaries, the pitfalls of codependency in a relationship. Now, codependency is when one or both people in the relationship essentially give up of themselves and become completely reliant and enmeshed in the other person. I'm obviously simplifying this very much, but I'm just giving an idea. And they give up their own needs and their own wants for the sustainability of the relationship and the other person. Now, this can be in terms of any relationship, a parent-child relationship, a friendship, a sibling relationship, a romantic relationship. These in any of this, if someone is, has a codependent style, of relationship, it could be that they have it not necessarily with all their relationships. It could be they have it with one specific person. And even if they only have it with one specific person, this ends up affecting all areas of your life, as you can imagine, right? It affects especially your relationship with yourself and your self-worth, right? So again, this is very surface. If you're interested in this, you could definitely look up. There's tons of research, podcasts, books, if you're interested to look into that. But why am I touching upon this and bringing this up now? Because I think that in this week's parasha, in Parashat Shemini, we're going to have two topics here that really talk about the importance of a proper, sustainable relationship with those around us, and especially, obviously, with God. So, when we see this through the episode of Nadav and Avihu, which obviously does not work out, right? Because Nadav and Avihu get killed. And then I want to also argue how Kashrut has a very important side of that as well, for the building part. So before we go into all that, I want to backtrack and let's see where we are, right? We're in Parashat Shemini. Shemini is 8, right? The 8th day. What's going on here? Where are we? We're in the 8th day of the inauguration, Yemei Miluim, the inauguration of the Mishkan. Okay, so they've been doing korbanot, they've been building it, and they've been learning how to do everything and practicing all the. What just happened? That was weird. Okay, I don't know. That was really weird. They've been getting the Mishkan ready, and now all this work after this 7-day ceremony, and essentially, which was the height of the 6 months or so that they've been building the Mishkan, right? And this is post Matan Torah, where they were so close to God, then Egel, where they ruined that. Now they spent all this time, rebuilding that physically and emotionally, right? We spoke about this a lot. And now we're finally at the peak of this, right? We're at the celebration of the final culmination. And we could imagine they have, immense happiness, immense pride, maybe a big feeling of relief that this actually happened, right? That this is actually finished, that the space they created for God is actually, successful, that God is in their midst, right? That God's, fire and cloud and his presence, so to speak, as much as it can be, is in their midst. And we're on this crazy, crazy high. And then tragedy strikes, right? Nadav and Avihu get killed. And let's just think for a second, we know, but let's just really get into the mindset for a second. Who are Nadav and Avihu, right? They are leaders of the nation, right? They are the sons of Aharon. And Aharon is one of the people that is the most connected to the nation, right? He represents them as Kohen Gadol. He represents that he is this, the Moshe's right-hand man. And his sons are obviously not obviously, but his sons are following in his footsteps, serving in the Mishkan, serving for God, leading the people, and then they die, right? And when we think about it, they don't die for doing some heinous act such as, murder, adultery, something, horrible like that. They die from what the Psukim say is they die because they brought a fire that was not commanded to them by God. So now if you're the nation, right? Understandably so, and we see in the psukim, they were devastated, right? They didn't know what to make of this. They were in immense mourning. And again, understandably so. And there's many interpretations of what exactly they did and what was wrong and why they sinned and how they sinned. But from Psukim, we really see nothing so crazy, right? I mean, at first glance, we'll see more why in a minute. And so the nation is devastated. They go into mourning. Aaron's response is, at first he doesn't react, right? It says Vayidom Aaron, he's silent or still, right? There's different interpretations of Vayidom, but it's a lack of reaction. And then, which I'll talk about a little bit later, he does sort of react by the fact that after he doesn't eat from the korban chatat that he gives afterwards, which we'll talk about. Hold that in your mind, in your head for a minute. We're going to come back to that. So what is this whole episode? Why am I, have to do with relationships and our relationship with God and others? So before we answer that, I want to put that on the back burner for a minute. We're going to get back to it. But I want to focus on another question that a lot of times we don't necessarily look into. And the question I want to get into is, why did Nadav and Avihu feel compelled to bring this fire? I don't want to go in right now into the fact of what was wrong with this fire. I want to talk about the fact of what compelled them. Why did they choose to bring this fire that was not commanded to them in the first place, right? And if we look back to the korbanot, right, in general, we see that it could be a very positive thing, right? The fire, the korban, it's something that connects us to God, specifically the fire that they bought, right? That God's fire comes down, they're bringing a fire that comes up, they're trying to unite this relationship. So what caused them to initiate and impose this connection with God? And I use the word impose, like they're choosing to impose this connection with God right now. Why? What is driving them to do that? Now, if we look back into Sefer Shemot, to Ma'amad Har Sinai, we might see something that, at least for me, it's not always so much in my consciousness. When you think of Ma'amad Har Sinai, you think of Moshe going up, right? But we also see in the Pesukim that Moshe wasn't the only one. He was the only one who fully went up. But it says that Ata ve'Aaron Nadav ve'Avihu v'Shiv'am ziknei Israel, that Moshe, Aaron, Nadav, and Avihu, and Shiv'im ziknei Israel, they go up partially to the Har, right? They go up to the middle of the Har. So and then Moshe ended up going up to the full Sinai, but they're very intimately involved in the Sinai experience. It says that on some level they saw God, whatever that means, right? They were very, very connected and linked to God. They had a very, very high spiritual experience, intense spiritual experience, where they felt so drawn and connected to God in this Ma'amad Har Sinai. Obviously the whole nation did, right? But them specifically, they were on, they were the level right below Moshe in this whole revelation. So you could imagine how much that impacts someone when they have this intense connection with God. Now, so even though this is about a year later, right? This is already, time has passed. You can imagine that this whole time they're trying to figure out how to, satiate and figure out a way to actualize that spiritual connection that they have, that they feel so strongly to God. And now, when they're doing the Yimei Miluim, and they're culminating this, and they see there's so many parallels between the Mishkan and Ma'amad Har Sinai. Essentially, there's many. I'm not going to go into it now. It's just too broad for right now. But if you look into it, and especially the language, there's so much parallels and so much theories that basically the Mishkan is trying to recreate the Sinai experience on a daily basis for the nation, so that they could always have that connection. So when this experience for them is being re-brought to light, right, is being in front of their eyes again, so to speak, they need to, they feel a need that I have to do something about it, right? I have to do something. And what do? They feel like I need to just give to God, which is a beautiful thing, right? In a way, right? They feel like they need to connect and give to God. So they take this fire that was not commanded. However, what is the so on the one hand, this is all sounds very nice, right? They wanted to connect to God, they wanted to have that relationship with him, but it was asher lo siva otan. They were not commanded. And we see here, back to what we're talking about boundaries, is they are doing what they feel the other in the relationship wants, not necessarily thinking what the other wants. This is what they feel that they need to do in the relationship, as opposed to really seeing outside and into the other person, or in this case, God, into the other aspect of the relationship. Now, this is something that we have to be conscious of, not in our relationship with God, but also in all relationships, that every relationship, back to the whole codependency thing, every relationship has to be, or a healthy relationship, I should say. Not every relationship is, obviously, unfortunately, but every relationship should be, if it's a healthy relationship, should be a balance between the two sides. And meaning that each participant in the relationship should equally feel their own individuality as well as their connection to the other person. And we do that by boundaries, right? Because what does a boundary essentially do? A boundary essentially is saying, this is my identity, and that is your identity. And yes, we could connect to each other. However, we have to maintain whole in our individuality to build in this relationship. And if one or more of the partners in that relationship breaches that boundary, it starts getting blurry and things don't mesh the way they should, and the relationship ends up being unhealthy, unfortunately, right? There's actually, this just reminded me, I don't even think I should have actually brought it to show you if I would have remembered beforehand, but there's a book that I got from my kids. It's called Double Bubble or Bubble Double. It's one or the other. It's either Double Bubble or Bubble Double. I always mix it up. But basically, it's a very interesting book. I would Google it, look for it on Amazon. Definitely recommend it. But it's basically it's a book which teaches kids interpersonal skills, and it does it through the image of a bubble. That essentially we all have a bubble, and in order to connect with another person, we have to be able to match their bubble. And then when they're ready and we're ready, we could unite the bubble and be together. And then when they're ready and we're ready, we could separate the bubble and both maintain our bubbles and not pop a bubble. It's a very cute story. Definitely recommend looking into it. But basically, that's a very simple analogy and a way to show about this idea of breaching boundaries and being conscious of ourselves and the other person. And as we know, as many of us know, in human relationships, unfortunately, whether that be romantic relationships or friends or siblings or familiar, whatever relationship it may be, when a person in that relationship crosses the boundaries too many times or doesn't respect the boundaries properly, that relationship will end, right? You're gonna cut ties with that person because it's not going to be a healthy, balanced relationship. And at one point, if it gets to a point that one of the people is going to say, enough, this is not healthy. And essentially, this is what happens with Nadav and Avihu. I mean, obviously to an extreme, they get killed, but basically they're destroying boundaries they're destroying a boundary in their relationship with God, where they're initiating something that was not commanded to them, and they're taking this matters and relationship into their own hands, and therefore there's no space for them in the relationship anymore. There just isn't the space for them to be participant if they're not taking the other into account. And this is unfortunately the case here. And I listened to a class from Rabbi Foreman on Aleph Beta, highly recommended. He was talking, I mean, I'm going to take a part of it. There was other stuff, obviously. I'm going to take one of his points, but he actually compares this whole breaching of boundaries with Nadav and Avihu and this whole episode. He compares it to the first time where humans breached boundaries with Adam and Chava in Gan Eden. And that basically they too took matters into their own hands and to fulfill their needs, but blurring it and making it quote unquote God's needs, right? Or taking God out of the picture, right? And that essentially gets them kicked out of Gan Eden, right? There's no space for them anymore in Gan Eden because they took these things into their own hands. And it essentially invents or creates or brings in mortality into the world, right? It brings death into the world from the fact that they did this breach. And essentially these stories, if we really look at it, which is interesting, especially in the language, is two sides of the same coin. Because what happens in Gan Eden, God created for us, a place, a house, so to speak, right? In Gan Eden, he created that for us to be a place to build our relationship with him. And then we overstep a boundary and God kicks us out of that place, right? And we're not able to be in Gan Eden anymore. And here we as humanity create a space for God in the Mishkan, and Nadav and Avihu overstep that boundary, and that leads to their death. So the message here again, which we've spoken about many times because it's an important message, is really towing that line between, which is a very, very fine line between knowing our place and knowing God's place in our godliness, right? And it's a very hard line to toe, especially for someone like Nadav and Avihu, who were on such a high level that it blurs those lines even more, right? It makes it even harder because they are on such a high level and they were so connected to God that it makes it even harder to differentiate, right? It's very not simple. And someone who I think is the prime example of this and was able to be very successful at this was Aharon, right? How do we see that? I mean, many ways, but how do we see that specifically here? Is the fact that he was able to be Vayadom Aharon right after, and he doesn't respond, even though, I mean, it was an immense tragedy. He lost two of his sons, right? And in an instant, right? And he accepts that loss in such an extreme way and just doesn't respond. And then we see, like I've said again, which I want to talk about, is he doesn't eat the korban chatat, which I think is a response, which we'll talk about. And Moshe gets annoyed about him not eating the korban chatat and reprimands him for it. But then Aharon answers him and says, do you really think God would want me to be eating the chatat today? Like, is this the right thing to do? Is this the right place? Is this the moment? And then it says, Vaishma Moshe vayitav be'anav, and Moshe accepts this answer and it's good for his eyes, meaning he agrees with him and he approves of that answer. That it wasn't that Aaron was right by not eating from the chatat. So to understand this a little bit more, this reaction, let's backtrack a second and look at the korban chatat again, right? We spoke about this a little bit in Parashat Vayikra, that there are different types of korbanot, and one of the main differences is what is burnt and what is eaten, and by who it is eaten. And the chatat is partially burnt and partially eaten by the kohanim. And what does that represent, right? And the Baal korban, the person who brings the korban, does not partake in it. So why? The burning of the korban represents, so to speak, God eating it, right? God's involvement. And the Kohen eating it represents God's relationship and God's eating it in this, in the physical world, right? He's the representation, he's God's messenger, so to speak, in this world, to eat it, because God physically can't eat it, obviously. And the person who brings the korban does not eat it, because when you do a chet, right, when you do a sin, and you essentially, again, you crossed the boundary and took something and that was not yours, and now you're giving back as a tikkun for that in the korban chatat. So you have no right to eat from it because you're giving back because you took, right? So who are you to eat from it? So the Kohen has a place in this as a representative of God in this relationship to eat the korban. Now, Aaron at this point feels that he's unable on this day when his sons died, and he, in a way, accepted their death as an olah, right? The olah where you're completely giving of yourself to God, right? The olah is completely burnt, and there's no place for any human involvement in it, right? The kohen doesn't eat it, and the person who brings it doesn't eat it, and so he feels that in this instant that his sons were, that he accepted that, and his sons were complete. He gave in a way, or he accepted the fact that his sons were taken from him on such a level that he was too human in this instant, right? And yes, even though the Kohanim have an aspect of godliness, they're still human, right? There's still that line. And here Aaron says, I'm too human right now, essentially. And I don't feel like I have the ability to tap into that godliness right now, to cross that line into godliness at this point where my humanity is so so felt that I lost my children, right? And even though Moshe at first doesn't get this, and he's like, you didn't do what God said. God said to eat the chatat, and you're Kohen, and you should eat the chatat, and we have to do what God says. But here, Aaron was able to distinguish that, and again, he's towing this line of humanity and godliness so finely, but he does it with such grace and such insight that Moshe says, "You're right," and accepts that. So, he's really an example of that. Aharon's really an example of that, of how to balance this. And that's why essentially I think he was chosen. It's a cat, chicken or the egg, what was first, but his whole essence represents this, and he's able to do that balance so much that's why essentially, and that's part of the fact of why he was chosen as the Kohen Gadol, to not only be a Kohen, but to be the Kohen Gadol, the main, the representative of all, running this whole Mishkan. Now, so that's all very nice, I think. I mean, whatever. But how do we, right, non-Kohanim, or even Kohanim, but in this day and age where there's no Mishkan, how do we apply this balance on a daily basis, right? Because in the time of the Mishkan, this was something that was very at the forefront of people's minds, because they were bringing korbanot, and especially the Kohanim, they were involved every day. Even if you weren't a Kohen, you would have to go 3 times a year in the Shoshana Galim, right? So this whole process was very ingrained in your life. I mean, to more or less extent, obviously, if you were a Kohen or not, but even so, this was very involved in your life. And now, unfortunately, it's not. So I think this is where the second part of the parasha comes in, where we talk about kashrut, and the kosher and non-kosher animals, what we can and cannot eat. Now, kashrut is a chok, right? And we don't we can't say we fully, it's something that we do because God said so, right? That's essentially what a chok is, and we don't fully understand it. But it's a level of kabbalat ol malchut shamayim, like accepting God's sovereignty and rulership. But this doesn't take away from the fact that we can't, try to understand it and try to apply it. So, the Midrash actually talks about the fact that it says we shouldn't say, right, that I don't want to eat this food, this non-kosher food, because it's disgusting. I should say, wow, I really would love to eat it. That looks so great, but I can't eat it because of my commitment to God, right? So it's showing that this is about, kashrut has a large aspect of relationship, that I'm doing this because it's something that God wants. I'm doing this because I know this is going to help me build the relationship, because this is something important to him, to God, and therefore it's going to be important to me, right? It's sometimes like when you have a friend or a spouse or a sibling or whoever, that they might like a certain hobby or and you might not necessarily be interested in it, but you try to learn about it and you ask about it and you take interest in it because of the fact that you care about that person. So you might not necessarily like basketball, but if if your brother is captain of the basketball team and he's so excited for the championships, you're going to go and cheer him on, if you have a good relationship with your brother, right? So similar thing here is that I don't get this. I don't get why I can't eat this, really nice looking, not kosher plate of food, but I'm not going to eat it because God told me not to eat it. And I value that relationship and it's important. I heard a beautiful interpretation of a part of interpretation of why, of the signs of a kosher animal, right, are split hooves and that chews its cud, right? So I heard a beautiful interpretation of why those things specifically, and what that's supposed to show. So an animal that chews its cud and has split hooves are herbivores, right? They only eat grass and vegetation, and they're not predatory animals. And why is it? And we know that because if they chew their cud, it essentially shows that they're eating a lot of vegetation, which is hard to digest. So they have different parts of the stomach, and it goes down and up, and the whole digestive system. I'm not going to go into now, but it has that whole cycle because they have to break down the vegetation. And the split hooves shows that they could climb mountains and be in pasture for a very long time and graze, which is what they need to do, right? And we also see this in the Talmud, where it says that if an animal doesn't have upper incisors like canines that are used to eat meat in predatory animals, then you could assume that it chews its cud because they don't need it. If they don't have those kind of teeth, then they don't need to eat other flesh animals, so they're eating vegetation. And you could assume that it's kosher and has chews its cud. I mean, obviously split hooves you have to see, but the chews its cud you can't necessarily see. So what is the significance of us eating herbivores, grass eating herbivores, and not eating predatory animals? So if we go back to the flood, right, to Noach, before the Mabul, before Noach, we were not allowed to eat animals. We were only meant to eat things that are directly from the land, right? Plants and vegetables, fruits and vegetables, right? Plants. And after the flood, we were permitted now to eat fruits and vegetables, to eat animals in addition to fruits and vegetables. However, with a caveat, those animals have to be as connected to the land as possible. Now, why? Why is it so important for us to be connected to the land, right? By the way, I did a whole series on this, God and his land, if you want to look it up. But that essentially, that when we're connected to the land, we are seeing the relationship with God with us very, very very upfront and very obvious, that we're seeing that relationship through the land and through the growth and through the vegetation. And even if we're eating meat, we have to be sensitive to that and where we are in the food chain, and that it's all connected to God, and that we're only a part of that. We're not above that, right? It's very easy to feel above when you're killing an animal, right? But in eating an animal. But if you do it in the, ideally in the proper ways of the proper animal seed, and also in terms of shchita, right? And when we kill it properly and hopefully, humanely and properly, then you're also connecting that consciousness to God and to your place in, the food chain and the circle of life. We're seeing that, and it's very important for us to not get lost in that. And I think the sons of Aharon, they didn't see their place, right? They overstepped their place, right? Like we said, and they get killed, unfortunately. And Aharon knew his place and was very sensitive to that place to such an extent that he changed, gave Moshe a change of heart. And now us individuals, even past, not Kohanim, even past Mishkan, unfortunately, even in our acts of eating, of daily eating, of survival, right? We need to eat to survive. We should always be eating and sustaining ourselves with things that are going to link us to that connection and consciousness, to constantly be reminding us of that boundary and that line you need to toe with God, which is not a simple thing to do. So I think that just to sum it all up, is that this is not a simple task, right? This is something that obviously very great people like Nadav and Avihu weren't these evil people. They were very, very great people that were connected to God, and they unfortunately, failed, but it's something that we have to constantly be conscious of. And I think that obviously this interpretation of kashrut is not the be all and end all. There's many different interpretations of kashrut, of why and how and what. But I think this one is really connected to the episode beforehand of Nadav and Avihu, and how we could take that into our daily lives, in this modern time where we're not dealing with the Mishkan and the Korbanot. So yeah, have a great day.